up, open ears, let your mind go. Pop anonymous, y'all, breaking down the
Hey, what's good, everybody? This is Propaganda Anonymous, and you are tuned in to the Propanon Podcast. Join me as I explore topics discussed in the work of Robert Anton Wilson and interview some of the coolest people in the world. What do we talk about on the Propanon Podcast? We talk story, we talk symbolic anthropology, crime and criminology, alternative reality games and UFOs. We talk conspiracy theory, comedy, comic books and quantum physics, liberation theology, negative theology, terrorism and music, sex, magic and drugs, psychedelics, housing and love. This is the Propanon Podcast. Tune in.
Open your fucking ears, jackass.
On a cold February morning in the year 2000, I found myself waiting in line to enter the Hammerstein Ballroom on 34th Street in New York City to attend the Disinfo.com conference. This was an all-day event organized by today's guest, Richard Metzger, and his devoted team of badass cyberdelic revolutionaries. An event that, unknown to me at the time, would impact my life in more ways than I ever imagined as a 20-year-old acid-loving anarchist searching for illumination and enlightenment in the books of writers like Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary, and John C. Lilly. It was Robert Anton Wilson, scheduled as the headlining speaker, that brought me to the event in the first place. Months before attending the DisinfoCon, I was traveling throughout America on a cross-country tour as part of a college class called the American Odyssey. This class consisted of only a handful of students driving in a van with our professor and attending political protests and demonstrations all over the United States in the times leading up to the new millennium. This was an exciting trip, to say the least. As a class, we attended the protests of the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia, organized by the priest Father Roy Bourgeois, who had been seeking to have the School of the Americas closed because it trained and continues to train soldiers from many other countries in torture techniques and the most innovative ways in how to murder people. People like the great Archbishop Romero, the Catholic priest who was murdered by thugs trained at the School of the Americas one day when he was giving Mass in his church in El Salvador. Romero had made the grave mistake of taking Jesus up on his word that Christianity should be for the poor and downtrodden, which greatly upset the rulers of El Salvador, who ordered his grisly murder because he practiced liberation theology, or Christianity for the poor. Before this class ended, we attended a giant demonstration in Seattle at the end of November 1999, a demonstration that would later turn into a citywide riot once a group of Black Bloc anarchists started wrecking shop. The 4-day protest was aimed at disrupting the meetings of the World Trade Organization and drawing attention to the perils of globalization implemented by corporate executives and heads of state who pass international economic trade deals without consulting the everyday people of the earth affected the most by the outcomes of such deals. The giant protest would later be called the Battle of Seattle, and it would dominate news headlines for the next coming months. So, when I was listening to Richard Metzger speak from the podium that day at the DisinfoCon about how we've won, meaning the counterculture of the 1960s and those of us influenced by it, have essentially defeated the great beast and can now begin to take over the whole damn world if we wanted to, I was listening. Something was happening in the year 2000. A positive exuberance permeated the air throughout the whole complex that day, and I got a natural high with no drugs at all that lasted for several days after the event, just from running around and talking to everyone nonstop about everything that I thought was cool, which many of my fellow attendees also thought was cool. The theme of the event was a phrase borrowed from Timothy Leary, and it was, "Find the others." Once Leary was asked what a person should do after they had turned on, tuned in, and dropped out, and Leary responded, "Find the others." So at the Disinfo conference that day, I thought I had done just that. I have so many amazing memories from that day. I'll just share a few with you. I saw Douglas Rushkoff and Grant Morrison for the first time there. I got to listen to them speak and I became a fan ever since. I got to see the performance artist Joe Coleman shoot fireballs into the crowd from the Roman candles that he had hidden underneath his button-down shirt, and he lit a blaze at the end of his talk, leaving the stage in a haze of smoke like a true Mysterio magician that he is. I got to see the performance artist Kembra Falver and her band perform their fabulous Wall of Vaginas routine, which was comprised of 4 naked ladies covered head to toe in body paint, laying atop each other with their legs spread wide open, exposing their yonis, as Kembra, also naked and painted and slathered and splattered ultra white paint onto their pussy lips and legs, all while the amazed crowd cheered them on. And finally, I got to not only see Robert Anton Wilson speak, but I got to hang out with him in the green room before his lecture. The backstage area was packed. There was Grant Morrison over on one side of the space holding court, and there was Are You Serious in another area chatting up some freaks, and lots of people were walking through the zone. It was more like a party than a cloistered backstage area. There he was. I saw Bob Wilson, seated on the edge of a couch, chain-smoking cigarettes, not talking to anyone. I approached the sage with nervous trepidation, took out my copy of Illuminatus Trilogy, and then asked him to sign it, which he did so happily. And then I listened to him tell me how he got such intense stage fright before all his talks, which was one reason why he smoked so many cigarettes. I couldn't believe that the guy who co-wrote Illuminatus experienced any sort of fright about anything, because in my mind at the time, Robert Anton Wilson was as close to a superhero as one could get. Yet somehow, him admitting this to me, him sharing that one small sliver of vulnerability, made me think he was even cooler than I thought he was before the event. Wilson made me feel like a friend that day, even though I was just a fan seeking an autograph. We shared a few jokes, had a couple laughs. He signed my book, and then I went off, and then he went on stage. It's safe to say that the SynfoCon of 2000 greatly altered the trajectory of my life. I don't know if I would have even written my forthcoming biography of Robert Anton Wilson if I had not attended this amazing event in the first place. Essentially, my book was born 23 years ago, that cold February day in New York City, and I have today's guest to thank for that, Mr. Richard Metzger.
You were born in Cincinnati, Ohio, yeah?
I'm talking to you from Cincinnati, Ohio. I live here now, but I was born in Wheeling, West Virginia.
Okay.
When I was a young kid, it was actually a bustling city. But by the time I was in my early to mid teens, there was a recession in the late 70s that just destroyed all of the business in that town, and the coal mining and the steel mills and all that closed. So a town of like 56,000 became like a town of 20,000 almost, within, just like the blink of an eye. But strangely enough, you could get a lot of weird media there. You know what I mean? Like there was a used bookstore there that I used to go to that only recently closed down, I guess, because the owner died. But it was this weird, it was like underground magazines and comics and used books. Right. The place was called the Ultimate Paradox. Right. But I could go in there and as like a 12-year-old and just like spend like the guy wouldn't bother you. I could spend the entire day just like reading British rock magazines or Crawdaddy or, Rolling Stone. But just, there were just stacks and stacks and stacks of these things around. And, you'd spend like $1 and come out with like 10 old magazines, I mean, that was like the kind of kid I was. And there was an amazing library there, where I found in a pre-VHS era that I could rent, or from the library I could check out, I guess, cult films. Like I couldn't see Eraserhead in a movie theater anywhere within 200 miles of me, but I could get Eraserhead from the local library and watch it on a 16 millimeter projector in my parents' basement. So I was like really resourceful about just sort of feeding my head despite where I lived. You know what I mean? I think it made me more extreme, but I was like, I would buy albums through mail order and stuff like that. Like I would do like go around and knock on my neighbors' doors when I was like a 10-year-old and say, "I'll weed your yard for $10 or whatever," so I could buy, an Iggy Pop album that I would have read about in Cream magazine but never heard. But I'd read the description of what it was like so that I would buy it through mail order. I mean, that's how complicated it was, in the 70s to get your hands on that kind of stuff.
When did you, I guess, first get hip?
I was a extremely hip kid. I mean, like it was, I would say, I went from like, my interest went very quickly from like Batman to Planet of the Apes to James Bond to David Bowie. You know what I mean? And then William Burroughs and all of these things that were almost probably offshoots of being a Bowie fan.
Is that where it started? Do you think it all started with Bowie?
To a certain degree, yes. I mean, I can remember being 8 or 9. I don't know how old I was, but it was young. And he did a midnight special, the 1980 Floor Show, right? And it was the last hurrah of the Ziggy Stardust character before he, changed his look, and I just remember watching that when I was a kid and just thinking like when you're confronted with somebody like that for the first time, right? And especially at that age, it showed me a lot of different things simultaneously. Like, you can become whoever you want to be, being that main lesson. You know what I mean? Like you could change your identity into something like that some way. And I thought but that was it. But beyond that, it was, Bowie was always very, he would always talk about who influenced him. So, when, he did the interview with William Burroughs famously and I guess Rolling Stone, it sort of comes in that way, you know what I mean? And then I become like a hardcore Burroughs head. And then I got really into Timothy Leary and the Firesign Theater. And, so it was like that kind of thing. I was massively into Lenny Bruce when I was a kid. So, it's a matter of like all of those things. And you just keep going deeper and deeper, But like I say, I could get underground magazines that were published in London in my hometown in that one weird store,
Yeah.
So, I mean, but like I say, but a lot of it, I had access to magazines. That, I guess that's a good way of putting it, through the library, through the fact that magazines like Circus and Cream were distributed to the extent that you could buy them in a grocery store. And that's what I would stand there and, read about Lou Reed while my mother was grocery shopping.
Right.
You know what I mean? So that was, but you couldn't hear the music. You had to, especially if you were in a small town, you had to buy it first. And sometimes I go say buying it meant going to mail order, as I had to do with these Iggy Pop albums. But I was like highly motivated to buy records and books and when I was a kid, and I would have jobs and do stuff like that. And I had like a serious record collection, look, by the time I was in the 6th or 7th grade.
Nice. Were you the kid that turned all the other kids on to the cool music then in your little zone?
Some of them. Yeah. I mean, I always had extremely snobby taste. I was always very specific about what I do and do not like. You know what I mean? So if anything, I'm just an older version of who I was when I was 8, But yeah. So no, but but that was my thing. You know what I mean? Like it was underground culture and weird music, because it was like heyday of the post-punk era. I was massively into the Psychedelic Furs, Public Image Limited, Nina Hagen, Kraftwerk, things like that.
Interesting. That era of the beginning of the fusion of sort of electronic music with the punk rock spirit. You're a young kid walking around West Virginia with all these crazy magazines. You get into David Bowie and then Burroughs. When did you get into Crawley?
Very early on. Very early on. I don't remember how that would have come about, but I remember that I had read, I was already into Leary, so maybe like 14 or something like that. But I remember reading Leary first and then Crowley, because Leary had said in one of his books that he felt that he was the reincarnation of Crowley, although they were obviously that doesn't sort of work out in temporal terms because they were both alive at the same time. But I remember him reading that, and then when I read the Crowley autobiography, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. How I can see why Leary was so into this. But like I say, it sort of transferred. So I was really into Leary, and then I got really into Crowley through that, and then later into Bob Wilson.
Was it Burroughs that got you into Leary, or was it just the fact that at the time he was an entity, he was a known entity?
Yeah, it would have been that. I mean, again, going back to these magazines that were available at that time. So, a magazine like Crawdaddy, right? In Crawdaddy, you could read, you could read about the Firesign Theater, and Jimmy Page is interviewed by William Burroughs, and that's on the cover. You know what I mean? And so it was that kind of thing. Or you would read about John Waters, and people like that counterculture types were always represented in these magazines like Crawdaddy, which was a sort of a more out there version of Rolling Stone, maybe. It was like a news magazine, a rock magazine, but they were more underground certainly than any of the other ones, even more so than Cream. So in that way. And then, but also keep in mind too, that when the year that we're talking about, like, Leary's, what's his book called? Flashbacks, turn on the shelf, would have come out, and he would have been on like the Today Show, publicizing that book, I mean, Leary spoke at a local college, when I was a kid, I met him then,
Nice. And was that in West Virginia where he spoke?
Was.
Wow.
Yeah, yes, it was West Liberty College. He spoke out about when he was talking, he did a rap about the Mind Mirror software.
That being the computer game that he had a part to play in terms of creating, and it was supposed to implement his 8th Circuit model of intelligence. Well, what did you think of Leary as a public speaker?
Well, okay, a couple of things. One is it didn't seem that interesting at all, to be honest with you. And Leary was a very bad public speaker, in my opinion. If you listen to his speeches, sometimes he's on. Most of the time, he is rambling. He has a hard time making a point. He's undoubtedly got high.
Yes,
as I have done just before this interview. But undoubtedly he was, quite stoned, and it seemed that way. He was never a particularly articulate public speaker. I never thought. And I've heard him do so many speeches, so many times over the years.
So it's around 7th grade, maybe, that you find Crowley and Wilson.
A little bit later than that.
Okay.
I actually went through an Ayn Rand phase when I was like about 13. Yeah, and then and as it's weirdly enough, the antidote to Ayn Rand was Herbert Marcuse for me. Because it was like I was massively into Ayn Rand, and to the point where I had collected all of her magazines and her newsletters. I had like cassette recordings. I mean, this is in the 70s, right? I had cassette recordings of her speeches and shit like that. You could order them from the back of her paperbacks. It's funny too, because whenever I meet somebody who's into her, it's like, and I criticize her, and they say, "Yeah, but you haven't read it." It's like, au contraire, because I can to this day recite it like chapter and verse pretty much. I mean, I know it like that. But in one of her books, it's I think it's called The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution, just a collection of essays. But I don't know if she wrote it because there were other people who contributed to it, but she was so adamantly against Herbert Marcuse, or whoever wrote it. Was so adamant. I thought, wow, this is like this guy is like Satan incarnate. How bad must his ideas be that it scares these people so? And then I read Herbert Marcuse, and after that, I was like very quickly on the road to like being a Marxist. You know what I mean? Like the Ayn Rand like dropped, and then I would have that's what I say. That's what I would have picked up on the Burroughs and the Crowley. It wasn't concurrent. Just after.
What was the kind of pivot point then from Rand to the ideas of Marcuse? What was it specifically, maybe, if you can recall, that Marcuse was laying down that
utopianism, as opposed to laissez-faire capitalism. You know what I mean? Like I mean, I was a kid in West Virginia. One of those concepts was easy to understand, but i.e. capitalism, because you're growing up in that scenario, but the idea of it's utopian as opposed to antagonistic in a sense way of life for human beings.
So I'm curious then too, what was it about Rand that really captured your imagination? Was it her emphasis on the individual, or what was it exactly?
I think, I think it was because of the, the heroics. I'm making air quotes as I say that to you, but as the heroics of her fictional characters.
John Galt.
Yeah, that kind of shit.
That's
I was
great.
massively into her.
Yeah, well, she seems like sort of like an intellectual that a lot of young thinkers kind of process through. So that's great, man. So you went from Marcuse to Burroughs to Leary to at what point did you come across Robert Anton Wilson then? Was that through reading Leary?
The thing to keep in mind is that those books were always around. Mm-hmm. So if I like certain kids that I would have hung around with were really into Tom Robbins, Kurt Vonnegut, and the Illuminatus trilogy would have been a part of that. You know what I mean? Like that's the literature that, like the really hip kids would be reading. Kurt Vonnegut, you know what I mean, was huge then. Mm-hmm. It was like almost everybody who read Kurt Vonnegut. You know what I mean? It was like it was mutually agreed upon. I mean, people don't remember that now, or they're too young to, but I mean, like it used to be like every garage sale that you went to, there were like, dozens of Kurt Vonnegut books for sale right alongside of Jaws, The Exorcist, Fear of Flying, and The Godfather. You know what I mean? Like they were like really widely read books. That was the sort of crossover, you know what I mean? Like the kids who were into that, like they would also be into Illuminatus, and people who were also into like, fantasy novels and stuff like that, because of the way that it was marketed at the time. His books, Wilson's books, were always in the sci-fi section.
Where exactly did you find Illuminatus, say, for the first time?
The mall in St. Clairsville, Ohio.
How did you end up in New York City, man? From West Virginia to New York City?
Well, by way of Amsterdam for 6 months, and then for just under 2 years in London, and then I went to New York when I was 19.
What brought you to Europe?
I was like really convinced that the world was going to end at that time, right? And I'll tell you why I thought that. It was because I had been fed a steady diet of books about the rapture and the Book of Revelations and all of that kind of stuff in my parents' church, right? Mm-hmm. Always, Hal Lindsey books, The Late Great Planet Earth, and all of these other, these other sort of, and that was a bestseller like Jaws or The Exorcist as well. The Late Great Planet Earth. These books sold massively at the time. They were, there would be a movie that Orson Welles would narrate. You know what I mean? Like, this was like in the pop culture. You could buy those books, or Chariots of the Gods. You could buy those at a Kroger. I was convinced the world was going to end, right? Public Image Limited I saw them live. It was so demonic. It was an utterly mind-bending experience to watch them on stage. You know what I mean? It was funny. I later got to tell Keith Levine about my experience there. But as I was there, I was just like, fuck this. I'm not going to college. I'm just going to go and do something fun. And then that thought went to, well, where am I going to go? And then I was literally reading one of those like Time Life travel books in the library of my high school, and it said that pot was legal in Amsterdam. I thought, wow, that's got to be awesome, right? And I was also really into Nina Hagen, and her Nun Sex Monk Rock album is full of these weird, like evil, like mystical, references to Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, oh, that's where I'll go. You know what I mean? And nice. So I ended up, being a squatter there, and then also in England. And I went to live there. It was because it didn't speak Dutch was one good reason. But I went. There was a woman involved, with I'd fallen for her. Yeah, so that's how I ended up there. And then after a while, I have to say, London felt really small to me. I mean, that seems absurd to say that now, but 38 years ago, it started to seem like, okay, I'm doing the same things. I'm seeing the same people that this isn't working out for me. Try my luck in New York now. I mean, they were fairly whimsical decisions in a sense, you know what I mean? Like there wasn't like any grand plan of like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It was just like, I just got there and I'll figure out what I'm going to do when I get there. Because when I was a kid, it was like, I lived in a lot of different squats. At one point I was in two different squats, actually. A Blind Butcher from My Bloody Valentine. She had an infant son then, and her boyfriend, the father of the child, was one of my best friends.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So, so there were, there was like an entire squatted apartment building, and there were people living in. But
was that in London?
It was, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I squatted in Amsterdam too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Amsterdam kind of has that legendary squat scene.
Well, I stayed.
Around.
Yeah, well, I stayed for a while in the Wires squat, which is the legendary squat.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen that with my own eyes. That was an incredible thing. It's weird. It's like you look about that up online, and there's not that much documentation about it, right?
Mm.
But it was a squat it was a massive, massive building that had been, I think, two different factories were in this. It was like it was like bigger than it was like a city block, but like a massive city block,
Mm-hmm.
and it had been taken over, and the idea was that the upper floors is where was hot water, and there were more bathrooms because it was all communal.
Mm-hmm.
And if you were accepted in by the group, then you had to live on the first floor where there was no hot water and one bathroom, and take cold showers. And then when a place became available, a floor up, and people would literally just like brick off they would brick off a little wall. And then with a door, you know what I mean? Like that was the scene there. So it was, so it was like a lot of punk rock kids, and people with like, pet rats on their shoulders and stuff like that. It was that kind of scene.
Wild. Nice, man. So you're there for a couple years, soaking up the Amsterdam culture, end up in London. So are these sort of the squats that in London that, the Clash sang about? Were you in the sort of similar zones, or take me to that scene now? Because squatting in London, I don't know. I haven't heard anything about it.
Not done anymore.
Years. Yeah, I don't think it's impossible.
It's not done anymore. It's not done at all. But
shot.
This was at the height of it. Say was the 70s into the early 80s, and I squatted in an area called Brixton, South London, and there had been a lot of riots just before I got there, the so-called Brixton riots, and that you can find a lot of documentation about that.
Mm-hmm.
But there were tons and tons of squats, and it was weird because it's funny because I went to that neighborhood for the first time in 38 years, or as many times as I've been to London since I lived there. I'd never gone back to Brixton. And then I thought, oh, that's going to be really fun, and see how much it had changed. And it really, oddly enough, hadn't changed that much. I mean, it was more respectable than it had been then. There was less crime and a lot more white people, but it was, it hadn't changed as much as I thought it would have. Strange. But these places that have been squats were now, $800,000 terrace homes, so.
Yeah. And Brixton as a neighborhood, was that mostly like Jamaican residents and stuff like that? People who were there?
It was. Yeah. I mean, I can't, it's so long ago that I can't remember. I wouldn't dare like say what the percentage, but it was probably more than half people from the West Indies. And then, and just like there were a lot of squatters, you know what I mean? But there were a lot of Rastas. That was the thing that was noticeably different from 38 years ago. There were no Rastas, right? Whereas before, like, remember these Eddie Grant songs, Rock On Down to Electric Avenue,
sure,
and Living on the Front Line? Mm-hmm. Both of those songs reference Brixton, right? The Electric Avenue is the first street in South London that had electricity. Right. And that was a known place where Rastas would hang. And also the Front Line, which was Railton Road. Right. And that one of the main streets going through Brixton. And that whole, like, when I remember at the time, it was like completely just a corrugated iron fence on one side of the street. And there were lots of security cameras. And then on the other side of the street was just dense with Rastas who were like selling like dime bags and smoking joints openly and drinking beer and playing basketball or soccer. But it was like, it was just like a completely barren park with like no trees, it was like very minimal, and so and that was like sort of the gauntlet that I had to go to get home every day. You know what I mean? That could sometimes be a bit heavy, you know, because I'm a white American kid who's 17. You know what I mean? But yeah, that's what it was like back then. But I asked that there were no Rastas, right, when I went back, and I asked my friend Rod Stanley, who lived there for a while, like, what happened to all the Rastas? And he was like, oh, those guys all made a fortune selling their houses and moved back to Jamaica.
Okay.
So that's where they are.
Right on.
You know, it wasn't even like you saw like an old guy with like gray dreadlocks. So we're like, no, Rastas. Whereas before it was like, you know, you could have been in Kingston, you know, for that, you know.
Heck yeah, man. And what was the what was your take on the counterculture scene in London at the time? Late 70s?
This would have been like 83.
83. Okay. Yeah. What was your read of counterculture then? Were they similar? Was it a similar vibe as the States? Or because today it's basically global sort of culture, you know. So I know in the 80s it was still very distinct, between what people were perhaps into or what got represented. Like, what made it to London at the time from America?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of counterculture, the thing that was, you know, what's homegrown versus, you know, somebody like Burroughs coming in and doing a reading at, like, there was a famous bookstore in Camden called Compendium Books. And that was the place where, you know, if Burroughs was going to come through town, he would read there, you know, Leary or anybody of note who was kind of an intellectual would read there. You know, that was a meeting point for a lot of people, gravitated towards that bookstore. And so there was that, but I would say that the homegrown counterculture at the time, you know, think about it, there was a hell of a lot of music going on, obviously, but the thing that I would say is that straddles, like, you know, it's counterculture and punk, was crass. That was like the thing. I mean, I would not say that I myself was a crass punk, because I think that implies the uniform and being fairly crusty, but I was
like kind of the gutter punk representation of punk rock and stuff like that.
Yeah. But I was crass punk adjacent, right? Like, I was massively into them. I was like a vegetarian, you know, a vegan at the time. You know what I mean? I was really into like raw food when I was that age, and that was the thing. And there was an event that happened. Well, they did it twice, but it was known. If you look this up, it's generally thought of as being the first anti-globalist demonstration of any note, of any size, right? And it was called Stop the City, right? Okay. And it was this thing where it was like basically just sort of whispered about, oh, stop the city, stop the city. People were just talking, are you going to go to Stop the City or what? But that within that, you know, sort of squatters circle, as it were, you know what I mean? The people that you would know socially, a lot of them were really into crass. And so this was a known event, right? Mm-hmm. So basically it was like, show up in the city of London, which is to say the financial district, right, around Threadneedle Street, and you know, show up, and we're going to stop capitalism from operating for a day. Mm-hmm. Right? And I got that. And I remember going into some place to buy something, and there was almost no one there. And then walking out of the store, and suddenly there were hundreds of people. You know, as the French say, it was like a manifestation. Mm-hmm. You know? And there were quite a few thousand people who showed up, and you know, basically just menaced stockbrokers and bankers, and, you know, things like of that nature. You know, was just, you know, I mean, if you look at any existing film and video, and there's a little bit of it, you know, you just sort of see kids giving, you know, guys in suits hard times. Right. But there were a lot of bodies. There were an awful lot of bodies there, and it probably did stop some stuff from going on. Who knows? But anyways, I ended up being caught up in what's called bottling, right? Kettling, right? Mm-hmm. Where they start moving the cops just keep moving the barriers closer and closer until they compress an awful lot of people into a very small area. And then they hold you there until they are good and sure that you need a piss. And then they will let you dribble out and go find a place to relieve yourself. But that was like, you know, so like that day, so I was in the middle of that kettling effort on Threadneedle Street when I was a kid. I read that the British comedian David Baddiel was also there.
You got your first taste of sort of anarchy in the streets, I suppose. The Stop the City demonstration of sorts.
I mean, that was the thing, is that kind of stuff was going on a lot. I mean, to it as an American, especially somebody from, a small town like I was, Britain seemed like it was falling apart. Like there was a potential for like a real revolution to happen there.
Mm-hmm.
That seems laughable now. But at the time, there's like the miners' strike and, just punk rock. And there was just a lot of, people were up in arms about, a lot of things, living conditions being on the dole.
Mm-hmm. Maggie Thatcher in general. When did you end up in New York?
The very end of 1984. A weird story that I can tell you about my first night in New York City.
Nice.
I moved to New York and I moved there with a friend of mine. And so like he had a car, right? So we put all of our shit in the car and I moved to New York that way. And we, basically found a super cheap hotel room, listed in the Village Voice, threw our shit down and went out, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's go out and do something fun, right? And I'd heard about Danceteria, right? And I wanted to go there. Okay, let's go. And it opened at like 11 or like 10:30. It was open. And I didn't realize that no one is going to show up until after midnight at all. There's going to be no one there. So we probably got there at like 11 o'clock or something like that. And there was no one there. And then a few people came and we ended up having a chat with this guy. Was this like really good looking black guy in all leather. He had like leather pants and leather jacket. And he had this like beautiful blonde Swedish girl with him. And he basically, said, "Hey, I've got like a lot of Coke with me. Do you want some Coke?" And so the next thing I know, I've got this like brown paper bag, you know what I mean, with like a serious amount of cocaine in it. And then so we're doing that, and then people start to show up, and none other than Michael Alig, later, the subject of the Party Monster.
Yeah, the party kid, raver that I guess murdered a friend of his on a bad K trip, I guess you could say, and then left the body and chopped up the body and left it in his apartment for a few days or something.
Yeah, that's the guy.
Mm-hmm.
But at the time, he was young. I mean, Michael would have been a first year student at Fordham. Anyways, he was there, and his this female friend of his. And they were like, "Oh, tonight is an opening at Area. Do you want to go?" And I'm like, I have never heard of this nightclub, but I'm like, fuck yeah. And then it's explained to me that, in the cab, that this nightclub changes its decor every 6 weeks. It's a new theme. It can be religion or isolation or, a color or, nature, whatever. And then they would do it literally there were a lot of like, as you walked in, there was this long hallway full of these like rooms that were like glass, almost like you were in a zoo, right? And sometimes famous people would be in some sort of tableau doing that. You know what I mean? Like Fellini had his birthday party there, and they had a bunch of girls as Venus in the half shell, sort of greeting him. But anyway, so it was like, okay, they're telling me about this thing, and so it was the opening night of their religion theme. And so we got out of a cab and, right in front, how that trick works. And the crowd parts. And we literally I'm this kid from nowhere with these two other kids. And it was just like, we got in for free and everything. I have no idea why, but this happened. But as we were walking in, I looked down the street and there was a group of people marching towards the nightclub down Hudson Street, and they were holding a guy on a cross who had flaming arrows in his stomach, right? And that was a performance artist by the name of Bernard Zett, and he was brought in and put into a pool that had sharks in it.
Lovely.
Okay, what kind of nightclub this was. But anyways, so the point of this story and the reason why it has some significance is Andy Warhol is there, right? There were a lot of famous people there. It was like Joan Rivers and the B-52s and the Psychedelic Furs and Allen Ginsberg and Philip Glass. I mean, there were like a lot of like, that club attracted a lot of very famous faces, and there were always a lot of them at any given time. So you could like look around the room and see all these kind of people. Anyways, Andy Warhol was there, right? And Michael Ailig says to me, "Oh, do you want to meet Andy?" I'm like, "Fuck yeah." Right. And as we're walking, he takes a running start and with both hands shoves me from behind into Andy Warhol, who I knock on his ass. Okay. Now he saw that happen and he did not address his anger towards me, but towards Michael. He was pissed off. He had every right to be.
Mm-hmm.
But that happened. Like a famous murderer to be on my first night in New York City pushes me into Andy Warhol in the Aryan nightclub.
Did you get to speak with him at all, Warhol, or was it after that?
No, God, no. Fuck no. I mean, I saw him around parties after that, or events or whatever, but until he died. But no, I never talked to him after that. But, I mean, that was the thing. I mean, like if you were at a party and Warhol was there and Mick Jagger and top supermodels, you knew you were in the best. And you're in New York City. You knew you were in the best place to be in the world that night.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing else that was going on that was cooler than that kind of thing. It was weird. And when Warhol an it was like this vortex, just like this, all of that energy just got sucked out of New York City. It was there's almost like an BC AD type of like line of demarcation in New York's cultural life, especially New York nightlife.
When did Warhol die? What year do you know?
I think 87.
Mm.
And after he goes, it becomes very like Beastie Boys / hip hop.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas prior to that, it was like this kind of sophisticated art scene, people who did things for a living, you know what I mean? Like who were like real artists, real magazine publishers, real writers, you know what I mean? Like people that you knew and you read about were out and about, and that just stopped after that. And it became, like I say, hip hop and also club kids.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a big turnoff for a lot of people. So the nightlife just sort of changed quite a bit. Like I say, when Andy Warhol died, it was definitely something that happened, if you will.
So, from 80, when you first arrived, say in 84 to, number of years that you're there, then what were some other kind of, personal landmarks for you along the way to this event, to this great Disinfo conference of 2000, like this interesting collection of artists, performers, speakers, intellectuals, musicians that you were able to gather and corral for that event. So you had the idea for the Disinfo conference, but you were also working on multiple fronts, like because Disinfo it eventually became a website, but before then it was a TV show. Like, I'm just curious.
No, it was a website first.
Mm-hmm.
And it was infamously funded by John Malone and TCI, and they had no idea what their money was going towards, or that over $1 million had been spent on what Malone called anarchist bullshit when he finally saw it. And that I retained the control of that copyright and the URL, and it sort of turned into a business after that. And did publishing, web stuff, movie distribution into theaters, and also theatrical documentaries and DVDs. So that was the mainstay of it. And then I did a television show that I shot in 1999, and it aired in 2000. And then I shot another series after the Disinfo Con that aired in 2001. That was for Channel 4 in Great Britain.
So the website starts about when? It was
I got a job working for a place called And Interactive, AND, right? And those were the initials for the three guys who started it. And they were doing, like CD-ROMs and stuff like that. And then the idea of, oh, here's the internet. And then one of these guys was extremely good, slick dude, smart as hell. And he was very good at giving a very convincing speech that convinced, some very wealthy people to invest in him. Right. So I would say that I probably was one of maybe the first dozen people to have a job, like a job where you're getting paid every week and taxes taken out to produce web content. And that is where Disinformation as a website was developed. But before that, it was developed as a TV series idea that Oliver Stone was going to executive produce.
And tell me about that. What was that sort of idea? Was that what became Disinformation, that the TV show that later aired on Channel 4?
No, not at all. No, the original idea was to do something that was like a straight up 60 Minutes type documentary series for like a network. It was the era of like Twin Peaks and where they were looking for something like that. You know what I mean? Like, and so the idea of having Oliver behind it I thought seemed like a highly attractive package, but it was to do, what I would say would be like 90s conspiracy theory culture where, like CIA stuff or, things that could be proved, not wild stuff, but things that, historically happened, or things that were current, that were going on, like it'd be like a really but coming from the point of view of like maybe a magazine like Covert Action, if you know what that is, right?
Yeah. Covert Action just being that sort of magazine for people into espionage or whatever, things like that.
Well, more like anti-it.
Yeah, right. Sure.
Try to understand it and expose it, and but it was that kind of thing, and then that got made into the website ultimately.
Wow. Right.
I got that job that I was just describing through Oliver's patronage.
Okay. How'd you meet the legendary Oliver Stone? How did you guys come across each other?
Just a cold fax saying, here's this idea. I'd love for you to put your name on it. And I got a call back the next day. From his business partner, Janet Yang, saying he is shooting in Vietnam, but he's into this and he wants to meet with you.
Wow.
He's going to be back in about 2 or 3 weeks. That's how that happened.
What year was that around?
1991.
91. So this is when JFK came out, around that time.
Yeah. It was after that.
So this is peak Oliver Stone. This is
for sure. He was at the height of his power, and as a director and as a cultural, force. And just a Hollywood force, you know what I mean? I mean, it's too bad that it never happened. The two of the agents who we had a meeting with, because they were trying to lure him over to what I think to CAA, and he was with somebody else at the time. But it was the two guys who had sold Twin Peaks, and wow. Those guys were not able to move it, even to try to get him as a client. They couldn't, you know what I mean? Like but it's like I say, it seemed like a good idea at the time,
For sure. Yeah, man. That's amazing. And so that becomes eventually disinfo.com, which when did the website launch about? Do you remember?
I think it launched in early September of 1996.
That's early web.
Well, it is. But here's the funny thing about that, right? It was so early that it got immediate. It had a shit ton of traffic, like instantaneously. But there was one thing that I did that was very, very smart, if I do say so myself, was that I convinced the powers that be at TCI or their subsidiary to buy 6 months of advertising on the Netscape browser, right? And I put a search engine with just all left-wing websites where only things that were spidered were the things that I personally chose. And this is 96, so there wasn't a whole hell of a lot there anyways, but I wanted to it was a search engine for alternate information. That was kind of how it built itself at the original incarnation. But because it was a search engine, it allowed us to have the logo, which at the time was an eye and a triangle, right, in color, on the same page as Yahoo and NetSearch and whatever the other ones were at the time. Ask Jeeves, I don't remember what they were. Alta Vista, and there was the Netscape search page. And for a lot of people, that was their homepage. That was the thing that when you got someone to set up your computer for you, in a store, they set it to that. You're on the Netscape browser, it goes to the Netscape homepage, and boom, there's my logo. So I had a tremendous amount of traffic right off the bat. And the reason that I was so insistent that they do that was also I wanted to make sure that they were all in financially.
Mm.
You know what I mean? So there was several $100,000 that were spent on that buy. So I thought, okay, this is another way to keep it going. They're going to launch it. You know what I mean? So it was a high wire act for a while, but it launched and it got a lot of attention. And when I was written up in a lot of these, like, internet industry magazines. And the guy whose money it was, or his stuff, John Malone, saw it and he was not happy. Mm-hmm. So it was given back to me, and then developed independently by me and my former business partner, again, as a publishing company, DVD, events, television production, mm-hmm. and so forth.
And then the Disinfo Nation was airing midnight 1999 into the new millennium. Correct. And
it literally was, I think it started on New Year's Eve, if I'm not mistaken.
Awesome.
No, it did not on New Year's Eve. It was like New Year's Day.
Okay.
It was New Year's Day, because what sucked is I had done a Y2K piece thinking that it was going to air earlier than it did end. And so the piece was kind of neutered of its humor by the fact that it was already passed.
Right. And nothing happened.
Yeah, exactly.
How did you gather the troops for that? Were these relationships that you had cultivated years before? For instance, did you know Doug Rushkoff beforehand? I know you knew Bob Wilson beforehand. I'm pretty sure you knew Genesis Peorage beforehand. Did you know Graham Morrison beforehand? Did you know Kembra Fowler beforehand? Who Kembra kind of, her and her band kind of stole the show at Disinfo. I don't know if that was ever recorded, her performance.
It's on the DVD and it was in the TV show.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
The Wall of Vagina.
The Wall of Vagina, like legendary, mind-blowing, amazing art. Like for listeners there, like Kembra Fowler and her band, like they wear full body paint, magenta, dark red, blue, turquoise, or purple body paint, huge sort of
blue and red.
Blue and red. Her band mates, I suppose, they're all naked. And then like 3 or 4 of the ladies like laid on top of each other with their legs spread. And Kembra did her thing with a turkey baster and white paint and just slathered it everywhere. And I just remember the crowd was like shocked and amazed and loving it. And it was beautiful and it was awesome. And then you came on stage introducing Robert Anton Wilson here to pull the cosmic trigger one more time. And then old Bob saunters over and just looks at the crowd with a bedazzled look and just says, "I don't know how to follow that."
Yeah.
And such quintessential Wilson humor, what a great night that was, man. I mean, did you feel it there? Like, when did you know, because I know during an event, it's very difficult. There's so many things that you have to take care of. You have to make sure all the artists are okay. So it's difficult to really enjoy the moment. When did you get to sit back, smoke a joint and be like, fuck yeah, that was awesome?
When it was over. During Bob's thing, because you're right. I was completely stressed out. I didn't eat. When I don't eat, I start to get like migraines, right? And so it was like that kind of thing. But yeah, it was, and there were just, I was just doing this, doing that, just making sure that things went along, people wanting to talk, whatever. So I didn't really get to enjoy that much of it. There were certain things that I didn't see at all, Like I saw, Doug was the keynote. I saw Doug's speech in its entirety. And I think that might've been it, to tell you the truth, until Bob's, I mean, like, I didn't even get to witness Kenneth Anger's until it was on video later, But in answer to your earlier question, I knew all of these people. I mean, with the exception of Kenneth Anger, who I didn't know, I was very good friends with everybody in this who was in it. I mean, Doug is one of my closest friends. You know what I mean? Genesis and I were very good friends. Paul Lawfully and I were very good friends. Joe Coleman and I were very good friends. Grant Morrison and I were very good friends, so I knew everybody there. And I knew Bob fairly well at that point too, because I met him several times over the years at, his shows, his talks in LA and stuff. But I'd interviewed him already for the Channel 4 show. So I knew him at that point pretty well. I'd spent a fair amount of time interviewing him, talking to him on the phone, or being there with him.
And so the motivation behind it, I mean, this was your baby, right? What made you want to throw this event?
I don't think it was my idea. I think it was my former business partner's idea. I think he was basically saying, we've got all of this money, i.e. this razorfish.com money that was invested into our brand, right? Let's use it. Let's do an event. And then my thought was, oh, what about an event, knowing fully well that I could get all of these people who we've just talked about with one phone call and it's done, and they're happy to do it, and I know that it's going to be great. I mean, it was like, it was just like, it wasn't like that list of people was like agonized over or really like thought about, you know what I mean? I wish in retrospect, I would have added more women to it. But at the time, I think we contacted Lydia Lunch and Diamanda Gallus, and neither one of them could do it. But it ended up being like, aside from Kembra and Magnuson, a sort of a bit of a boys' club. So there was a bit of regret there. But in any case, it wasn't like we sat around and thought, oh, who can we get? It was like, here's the list. You know what I mean? It was like, it was just off the top of my head in 5 minutes. Here's the list, And so yeah, I mean, like I say, they were all friends. But it was Gary's idea, and what I thought, okay, why don't we do this like the Nova Convention? The thing that was I think it was a 2-day celebration of the work of William Burroughs, that Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary and Patti Smith and Brian Geisen and a whole bunch of, it was sort of all these counterculture luminaries either gave a speech or they did a reading or they were on a panel, and then, where there was some kind of, musical entertainment, whatever. And so I thought, oh, let's just model it after that. And that's what we did do,
That's great. So that was the reference point for you personally, the Nova Convention.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it was that great kind of punk rock celebration of William S. Burroughs, who in the 70s was, considered in many ways a godfather of punk rock. From Lou Reed to Patti Smith to Mick Jagger, David Bowie, they all sort of applied his cut-up method to certain songs and whatnot. And of course, he was huge at that time. And as you mentioned, Robert Anton Wilson spoke at the Nova Convention. And you said in a previous interview with Doug Rushkoff on Team Human about how Burroughs, when Buckminster Fuller was alive, everyone knew about him. But when he died, the signal went dead. No one really knows about him. And almost the same with Tim Leary. But
sure.
Robert Anton Wilson is a slightly different case, though. Like would you kind of categorize him in a certain sense with Burroughs as there's this voice that continues from the grave with Wilson? What is it about Wilson, like Burroughs, in a way that why is his voice still relevant today, if you think it is relevant at all?
Oh, no, I do. I definitely do. I think both of them are very relevant. I don't know if I have a concise answer to that one, though. I mean, if you are interested in learning how to think, both of those writers have got something for you. If you're learning how to, to change your mind or to, get involved with magic, or, there's a lot of deep ideas there to mull over.
Yeah, man. And one of the most interesting metaphors, I suppose, at least that I found about Wilson that is very, prescient or relevant for today, is the whole notion of the Chapel Perilous, right? Mm-hmm. This sort of journey through a type of madness to come out the other side, hopefully a better, more calm and agnostic sort of thinker. And when I was writing my book about Bob, right, Chapel Perilous, I asked awesome people if they themselves had experienced their own sort of Chapel Perilous moments, right? And when we were speaking at a previous time, you told me this pretty amazing story about your own journey through Chapel Perilous, or a type of Chapel Perilous. If you recall, it was I think you said you're 29. You were in a super Terrence McKenna mode. You were living in New York City, working at the Paramount Hotel, and smoking DMT 4 times a day.
Yes, that's all true.
Very quickly, yeah. What could you say you learned from that sort of experience in your time dealing with those?
Well, when you're talking about Chapel Perilous, you're talking about the concept of initiation, right? You're talking about, which I think Wilson covers the best, not even necessarily in the Cosmic Trigger, but in the Mask of the Illuminati. That is what that is, an initiation story. You know what I mean? And it shows you, I think that's actually his best book in many ways. But it's initiation that we're talking about, right? And so I think that, and I think it's something that goes on for your lifetime also. But for me, I started getting involved in the occult, or, interested in that from my interest in Crowley and Kenneth Anger and things like this. But it wasn't an interest that ever went away from me, right? But it became a much greater concern of mine in my late 20s. And I found that at the time, I had achieved some level of success in my mid 20s that by my late 20s had already, it was in the rearview mirror, and I was working at a hotel. I fucking hated the job. And, it was a drag. And a friend of mine had a steady source of like really good DMT. And I was really like I say, into a Terrence McKenna mode at the time. And so I was smoking DMT constantly, and I was constantly having really strange coincidences happen to me. Right. And it wasn't like I was looking for them, but I would notice them when they happened. Right. And one of those coincidences actually does involve the cosmic trigger. So it's very, it's to the point. I'm going to actually show you this in a second, but because I have all the receipts for the story I'm about to tell you. So it's like Thanksgiving weekend, and I'm staying at the hotel, and they're like, you just want to stay in the hotel, get a room here, and stay for like 4 days because there's a lot of people want to take off, and you get paid overtime. And I'm like, yeah, fuck yeah. So I was staying there. And I was the maitre d', the concierge rather. And so I was there behind that desk. And if people got mail, I would give it to them, and I would make reservations for them for their hotel, or for the restaurants and stuff like that, or buy them tickets for Broadway shows and whatnot. Anyways, there was a dude who worked there who was a bellman, right? And he was this tall, like super good looking sort of male model, like sort of what I assumed to be a himbo sort of type guy. And I never really said anything to him other than, hey man, what's up? And, just passing him by. And so that Thanksgiving night, it's probably about 1:30 in the morning. Right. And he walks up to me and says, hey man, do you want to smoke a joint? I'm like, fuck yeah. So we go into the basement of the Paramount Hotel, which had been a speakeasy. So you get down there and there's literally like, it's like a nightclub that is just covered in dust. It's like, booths and mirror balls, and, it had been a speakeasy, and during Prohibition, and, but a really opulent one, but again, just covered with dust at this point. So we're down there, we're smoking this joint, and I've got, I also had weed on me. Right. And so I had in my bag, but in my bag, because I was staying there for 4 days, I had a bunch of books that I was reading. One of them was Terrence McKenna. One of them was Crowley. And one of them was the Cosmic Trigger, right? And this guy who I'm talking to, his name was Jason. He was saying, oh yeah, I've read this book. He's like, I sold this to the bookstore that I was working at right before I left LA. And I said, what bookstore was that? And he said, oh, the Brand bookstore in Glendale. I said, well, that's where I bought this. And then here is the book. You just have to pretend. If you're listening to this, you just have to pretend. And there's his name.
Wow.
Right? They wrote his name in it, so they knew it was his book. So when it sold, he got more money, I guess, because he was an employee there.
Got it. Okay.
Literally, and it's a book about crazy coincidences.
Right.
Boom, there it is. Right? Isn't
unbelievable?
Yeah. So, I mean, so that's, but, those kind of things have happened to me my entire life. But, and that's a very specific one. I'll tell you one more, right? That's like that. And again, I don't think these things ever add up. And again, I don't look for them, but I notice when they happen. How can you not, right? Here's the story. One day it's in New York. It's like 1988, maybe. And I'm in the front room of this apartment that I'm living in, and I'm cleaning up my bookshelves, and I've got stacks of magazines that I'm going through. I'm just cleaning up. And there's an 8x10 glossy of an ex-girlfriend of mine, like a headshot, laying on top of the stack. And my then current girlfriend, who I was living with, comes into the living room and she points to that and she says, "Who is this? I know her." And I said, "That would be impossible for you to know her, because the whole time she had gone to school in London, my present girlfriend at the time, whereas this British girl was living with me in New York." Okay. Right. She was a very uptight person. And when she sublet her apartment in the UK, she said, "I'm going to pay a certain amount of money. No one can sleep in my room." Right. She had this amazing apartment. And so no one can sleep in my room. And she was the type who would anyways, but that was the deal. I'm paying rent. No one sleeps in my room. No one can ever sleep in my room. Okay. So anyways, she and I got into this big fight in New York City, and she was going to go back anyways. And we were already breaking up, but it was like, okay, I'm leaving early. So she leaves early and goes back to London. In London, the guy who was her roommate or whatever, sublease was letting his girlfriend and another girl stay in the house because their lease had run out and they needed a month before they went back to New York. He said, "Oh, you just stay with me, right? She'll never use her room. She's in New York. She's not coming back until X day." Well, anyways, she goes into her bedroom to find this girl sleeping in her bed and has a proper freak out. And right. And so, but anyway, she was like, but I was like, well, and she comes back in and she was like, and she reads me this woman's address from her address book. And it was her address, right? Dig it. So a woman goes from my bed, literally my bed in New York City, to her bed where my next girlfriend is sleeping. And I mean, think about that for a second. I mean,
too much.
I mean, it's too specific, right? And then weirdly enough, the other girl who was staying there had the same birthday as me, right? And then even weirder, that there's a part two of this, is that same girlfriend and I were walking around the East Village when her mother came to visit, and her mother had been, I guess, kind of a groupie, and she was living with Don Preston from the Mothers of Invention in the 60s when the Mothers were playing in New York. They had a residency there for a whole summer, and she was living with Don Preston. And we're walking down St. Mark's Place, and she was like, "Oh, this is the building where I used to live." And I said, "That's funny. I used to live in this building." I lived in the same apartment as the mother of a future girlfriend of mine 20 years before. She lived there 20 years before I did. I mean, was this woman the love of my life? No. Was there any significance to any of this? Not that I'm aware of. It doesn't add up to anything. But I could waste your time all day telling you crazy coincidence stories that are literally that specific. They're literally that specific.
It's really interesting too, like just the topic of synchronicity, right? Which is a meaningful coincidence, something that's acausal. It doesn't seem like it's caused by A, B, or C. It's A somehow causing D, and it's just very weird and strange. And when people experience these things, it leaves an impression, obviously, because it's of personal significance and meaning. But it's interesting to think about, Wilson's book, which came out in 1977, was really forwarded or put the notion of synchronicity into the counterculture, as did other things after that, other books and writers and stuff. But we live in such an interesting age now where, I know that in Cosmic Trigger, one of the synchronicities that Wilson writes about is how he was writing about Sirius, and then all of a sudden he saw the cover of a magazine, and there was a band called Ramses, which somehow reminded him of the band in his book Illuminatus trilogy, the American Medical Association, which were the front group of the Illuminati who were gonna kill millions of people at a rock festival in Ingolstadt, So Bob was finding all these things that seemed to mean so much for him through sometimes the media, and oftentimes the media, right? We live in this age now where, thanks to surveillance capitalism and your computer and phone passively listening to everything you say all the time, you could talk about how you have a backache, and then 2 minutes later get a commercial on YouTube, advertising like a back cushion or something like that. Or this happened to me the other day, or just yesterday. I was speaking about how I needed to get an oil change for my car. 2 minutes later, an internet commercial on YouTube came up for Valvoline, right? Maybe 50 years ago, that would have been a synchronicity, right? But now, I guess what I'm getting at is we now live in this age of manufactured synchronicities. In fact, that could even be a type of advertising campaign, because you get into people's minds best when they're unaware of it, I suppose, right? But
it's updating Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent.
So another question is, Wilson, at least I got this from him when reading those books and all of his work, is that when you're experiencing synchronicities, it might be a sign that you're kind of on the right track, correct? Like you're kind of receiving a message from your inner, higher, whatever, deeper self communicating to you. So where do you file sort of synchronicities these days, Richard?
Well, I mean, it in two ways. One is, like I said before, I don't look for them. I notice them when they happen. I think that I interviewed a lot of people for this. I'm doing working on an occult TV show right now, where I interviewed 53 occultists,
Awesome.
which is so forth about this. And Gary Lackman, author Gary Lackman, he was saying that there's a resonance between the inner and outer worlds, where what you are thinking about or what you want seems to be known and understood by some entity which is outside of you, and so he says that, that magic is making synchronicities happen. It's induced synchronicity, right? And Christina Oakley Harrington, who owns the Treadwell's bookstore in London, said that that she considers the magic and witchcraft that she's involved with is making the less likely more likely. And that, and as she says, when someone talks about a coincidence and someone says, "Oh, what a coincidence," she says, "Yes, that's us. That we work with synchronicity, we work with coincidence." And so I think there's that, but also, I think what you were describing before about how, an algorithm is just going to pick up your thing. And it's not like, oh, I was just thinking about Lou Reed and, or I just wrote about Lou Reed in my Gmail account. And here's it. There's a woman, an author named Sarah Lyons, and she says that really the mark of a good mystic is when you know how to walk the line between, the cluttered nonsense of the universe and something real and tangible, whereas the universe wanting to speak with you. I also think, just to finish my point, I think a lot of the synchronicity stuff also, I think there's, if one were to study Crowley's interest in the holy guardian angel and the sacred magic of Abramelin the mage and why that was interesting to him, there's a lot of overlap there between the holy guardian angel and the way that you would have that knowledge and conversation of said holy guardian angel and synchronicities happening to you and weird coincidences.
Right. And this too, then being a major part of Cosmic Trigger Volume 1, where Wilson was kind of deconstructing this notion and getting under the hood, if you will, of how to contact your holy guardian angel. Right. So where the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel is I guess its origin story, if you will, is that the book Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, right, in the 16th century, 1600s, and how a magician is supposed to cloister oneself for 6 months and, adhere to like a strict diet and do all these magical rituals. And then along comes Crowley many years later, and he attempts that exercise, right? If it doesn't work out, right, he seeks to do the whole 6 months in that mansion or whatever in northern England, right? And then it's during his walk in China where I guess he imagines the temple in his own mind, and I guess he creates his book Liber Samek from that, which becomes sort of a condensed version of the ritual for contacting one's holy guardian angel, I suppose, right? And then occultists they use Crowley's version or program or to contact, say, to have that contact, which it seems like the occultist Carl Germer used Crowley's Liber Samek when he was in a concentration camp to achieve his knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, right? But then along comes Robert Anton Wilson in 1970s, who kind of hacks the system a little more and has this huge, which he says was his contact with his holy guardian angel, was during basically like a large acid trip in a darkened bedroom, and he's listening to audio tapes of John C. Lilly and Crowley's, I guess it was, well, the Bornless one, invocation, which maybe is part of Liber Samek. I'm not 100%, but my point is, isn't it interesting how dynamic this whatever this magic ritual is, that it changes over time, or it can be changed over time? Because I know Colin Wilson, he criticized Crowley, saying that he never truly completed the Abramelin the Mage 6-month ritual, and this actually cursed his life. Colin Wilson seemed to hate Aleister Crowley. You know what I mean? Like, so this sort of cursed his life, and no, he never achieved this when he was walking across the plains of China or whatever. But then along comes Robert Anton Wilson, who is sort of that bridge then between that thelemic ceremonial magic and then these punk rockers out of England, these chaos magicians, who they don't seem to, well, it seems sort of varied. Some of the chaos magic doesn't seem to give much credence to this whole holy guardian angel thing, or I could be mistaken. Maybe they take an even more relativistic view that, maybe we have multiple holy guardian angels, right? Like, how do you know now when you are, contacting the source? Like, for instance, Richard, when you had that awesome, like, that's just a wild synchronicity. You're smoking a joint, and it always involves weed somehow too, right? Like,
well, in my life,
yeah, same, man. Like, but you're smoking a joint with this coworker, and then he's like, "Dude, that's my book," right?
Yeah. I bought his book about coincidence and synchronicity.
I
had it there at that moment. I mean, run the film backwards. You know what I mean? A few years to all of the events that conspired, to make that happen. Here's another thing that happened briefly, that in that same hotel, right, at the Paramount, I was trying to start a record label, and I'd sent a fax, right, because it's the 90s, to this woman in Rome to get the licensing for these 2 tracks from this label that she worked for, right? That day at my friend Terry's office, I remember going to her office and using her fax machine and then going to work. That night, that woman who I faxed in Rome handed me her American Express card. And I was like, holy shit. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But the thing is, what do they add? They never add up to anything, but they are interesting. And how can you not notice that? Oh, I just faxed you today in a foreign country, lady, out of the blue, and here you are in front of me. How did that happen? Mm-hmm. How did that happen? But that happened. But you think, like, did I work with her? No, that label never got off the ground. Nothing. That was it. It was that incident was in a silo connected to nothing else, except that there were a lot of things like that. Mm-hmm. But in my lifetime, they've never added up. They've never added up to one thing.
Mm-hmm. That's a great anecdote and observation on this, because again, it's, Cosmic Trigger is Bob is seeking to add it up to something.
Hey, it's pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. That's the thing it's pattern recognition. When you see this kind of thing, again, you don't have to look for it if it's sort of like that obvious and in front of your face. The thing I would say is, you say that Wilson hacked, he hacked initiation, but he short-circuited it with LSD. Okay. And that's Leary is the one saying that, because if you look at Leary's books, and I highly recommend them if you haven't read them, it's strange. It's like, I mean, with Leary, I think there's one reason why his books have not necessarily survived the test of time is they're kind of dated in the sense that there's jokes about Jerry Brown and John Denver and Farrah Fawcett. You know what I mean? It's like that kind of thing. But what he is essentially saying in a kind of a jokey wink wink way is he's giving away the whole farm on all of this initiation stuff. He's basically saying that what he started to notice was he's doing a lot of LSD. He's starting to notice patterns. And then when he gets forced out of his comfort zone and he's going, he's living, with Eldridge Cleaver and stuff like that. And all of these things start to happen, right? Mm-hmm. It accelerates that. What was the term? Free fall. When you live your life in free fall, that's when you're going to attract and notice the most magic. But that's a big part of Leary is being able to take LSD and just forget about the yoga, forget about the breathing exercises, forget about studying some mantra for a year. Just take some fucking LSD and boom, it's going to just smash the door down to your enlightenment. You will be holy. This is what he said. I don't think he was wrong.
Right. And, utilizing the Leary lexicon, re-imprint oneself into some higher form of oneself. That's a very kind of 70s message with the LSD. And I mean, that carried over into the 90s as well, and we're in such an interesting period now today, like especially over the last 10 years, the signs and symbols that were utilized that in the 70s, even into the 90s, perhaps meant one thing, but now even those countercultural signs and symbols have gotten inverted, subverted, beginning perhaps around 2016, and this new interesting era that we're in of seeking to see what carries through from that period, right? Like, does anything carry through? Like in your previous interview with Rushkoff on Team Human, you guys, discussed a bit this notion of the counterculture, what has survived, what still exists from that manifestation, and where it's at today, and part of that could be the conversation around synchronicity, right? And magic too. I mean, what is magic, right? Other than the classical definitions of changing one's environment or one's sense of one's environment in parallel with one's will, right? Are more people doing magic than ever before?
Undoubtedly. Undoubtedly. Oh God, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's two things. One is, I'm working on this new TV series, right? And I said I just interviewed 53 practicing occultists,
Nice.
And almost everybody had something to say about synchronicity, by the way, and no one said anything kooky or weird or whatever. It was all like highly intellectual, high level conversations with these people. I've got some amazing things on tape.
That's awesome. What's the name of? Have you released this yet? Do you know?
No. It's in fact I'm working on the pilot for it right now. There's 4 episodes were shot. Doug Rushkoff is the executive producer. He's the reason that it's all happened. There's 4 episodes that have been shot, and 2 of them have been edited to rough cut, and one of them is getting to the point today, literally while you and I are talking. The editor is working in in LA, to get that to the point where it's presentable and no longer such a rough cut, so it can go out to TV buyers, tomorrow or Monday. Do
you have a title for the show? Yeah,
it's called Magic Show.
What channels are you seeking to get it on?
One of the streamers.
Right, streaming channel.
Awesome. Whoever pays the most.
For sure, man.
But going back to this point is that if you look at what I subscribe to like all of these different TV industry things. So I get these here's a PDF of our survey of blah blah blah, and one of the things that I read recently was saying that like this in the global TV market, this is what they have too much of, this is what they want more of, this is what they would really like to have more of, and they don't have enough of. And almost everything in the top was not sex related, it was not music related, it was not sports related, it was things like witchcraft, psychic phenomenon. It was like in the top 20 things that the television executives are actively looking to find, it was like 15 of them were magic or psychic or in some way relating to the occult, and like 2 weren't.
Mhm.
And I mean, it was just like, that's what it is. So I mean, I'm hoping that the show is timed just right.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it, and it definitely is an interesting sort of a peak in the culture in terms of people interested in witchcraft and chaos magic and I mean, even Thelema, ceremonial magic.
Well, I mean, that's the thing about this thing is what I was interested to do was to present some very intelligent people talking about a topic with intelligence and using, great metaphors and, to describe these things. And I think hopefully it will inspire more people to want to go out and, it doesn't look kooky. It looks like, oh, these people have got like, rigorous minds. They're not just being themselves.
Mm.
It doesn't. None of these people make any claims to be something that they're not.
Mm-hmm.
See what I mean? It's not. None of them are goofy.
Well, yeah, I mean, like Crowley's take on magic in some ways, right, is this inner kind of mystical exploration of different dimensions within oneself that could be outside of oneself or whatever, if you will, rising through the planes. And then chaos magic has been, I guess, advertised, if you will, as results magic. Do this, like something like a sigil, create the sigil in which then the result can manifest in the universe, right? Like, do you have to get specific, but have you ever used sigils in order to attain a desire?
Yes.
So it works.
Oh God, yeah.
And magic works. That's the point.
It does work. It does work. It's a tool. It's a tool. You can do a lot of different things with it. It depends on what your intentions are and what you want, how good you are at it. You know what I mean? I mean, I've always looked at magic as like a mental martial art where, you just don't, on your first day, you're not gonna, get a black belt. You got to build up to it, but you get to a certain point where you're going to be more successful getting the things that you want.
So how do you get there then? What is it through Thelema? Is it through chaos magic? I know it's a mishmash of all of them, but if there's one thing.
Well, I think it's all of those things. I mean, for me, it's a mission. It's, yes, there's a strong Crowley current that goes through my way of thinking, but also Tim Leary, William Burroughs, Robert Anton Wilson, Lenny Bruce. I mean, these are the people who informed, my developing mind as a child. And so I sort of see the world through the glimpses of what I saw of their worlds through their books or whatever.
Magic works.
Mm-hmm.
Magic works. Richard, thank you so much, man. I appreciate this conversation. Getting into a little bit the backstory of Disinfo, what you're up to these days, and yeah, man, it'll be great to speak again. Maybe we can go dig a little deeper on the notion of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. I think that's a really interesting topic these days.
It's super important for people to understand that. It's you're getting to the same place that Robert Anton Wilson writes. Well, he did it himself. I mean, it's useful to know what that is. And it's funny too, because it just to close on this is that one of the people who I interviewed about this, Maja Daou, who is the White Witch of the Witch of the Dawn, I think is how she bills herself in Los Angeles, and she's one of the most knowledgeable people on the occult that I have ever met. I mean, she is fucking brilliant, and she's very convincing and rational when she talks about these things. And she was formerly the librarian at Manly Hall's Philosophical Research Society, the library at the PRC, and she was just one of the smartest people you could ever meet, and knows everything about the occult and ancient history. And I mean, she just knows it backwards and forwards. I mean, she's like a walking encyclopedia of this stuff. And she described that the Abramelin magic was the same magic that was being done by the likes of Abraham and Moses, because as she says in the show, that there was this they were getting knowledge from someplace else. And that's what the Abramelin magic is. But that would be the way to get to that place, to achieve that, again, to achieve the knowledge and conversation that, if you think about it, these biblical patriarchs, right? It makes sense.
Definitely. I love it. Yeah. I want to dig a little deeper on this, the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. But I'll pull back a little bit. But one thing that does come to mind briefly was, and I want to get your take on it, is, especially with UFOs or UAPs in the media all the time now, like Wilson and Cosmic Trigger Volume 1 was following this thread for a long time, that the origin of the Holy Guardian Angel for him was extraterrestrial at one time, and he even found like parallels then with Crowley's depictions of Aiwass, or just whatever, like alien shaped heads that Crowley seemed to sketch a gray alien before gray aliens became a trope in
lamb. Yeah.
Right. Lamb. Right. And, I'm just curious, like, what's your read on that? I know Bob eventually, came back down to earth, if you will, and settled on a neurological explanation for some of those things. But did you ever wonder, like, could some of these voices in my head be teleported from some, extraterrestrial place, or is that a 70s thing?
I don't know, but I will. I not in my life. I wouldn't have any experiences where I've attributed it to that. But I will say this though: Paul Lawfully had a cavity that he felt was a transmitting station that was beaming alien ideas into his head, and that's where some of the ideas from his paintings came from.